Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're talking about religious schools and children's freedom. Hello, my name is Emily McTurnan, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Today, our topic is religious schools. To some, they're controversial. Perhaps they threaten to undermine social cohesion or undermine people's tolerance of other religions. Maybe they're indoctrinating children. But others might think that it's just obvious parents have the right to choose how their kids get educated and to raise children within their faith. So who's right? And what follows for how a state ought to regulate and fund religious schools? To help us think through these issues, our guest today is a world-leading philosopher of education and parenting who has just co-authored a book on precisely this topic. So I'm especially delighted to be joined this week by Professor Adam Swift, Professor of Political Theory and Political Philosophy in the Department of Political Science, to talk about what to think about religious schooling. Welcome back, Adam. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Let's start with religious schools. What is it about them that prompted you and your co-authors to write this book we'll be talking about today?
Well, it was a topic that kind of completed the set in some sense for me, because I'd worked a lot on education and families from a kind of normative, moral, political philosophy point of view. But I'd nearly entirely focused on, until recently, I'd focused on kind of the social justice angle, the unfairness of private schools. Should parents be allowed to have them? Should we have private schools, fee-paying schools, that kind of thing? And I'd written a book about that, and then I'd done work on the families more generally, on parents' rights with respect to their children. And doing that had got me into the question of not only what parents can do for their children, or should be allowed to do for their children, but the other question of what they should be allowed to do to their children, kind of what kinds of control they should be able to exert over their own children. And I kind of came to view that we gave them much too much discretion. We grant them powers over their children that they shouldn't properly have. And these include excessive influence on their emerging views about how to live their own lives. And one of the ways in which I think parents exert excessive influence over their children's views about how to live their own lives is by sending them to schools that reinforce the message they get from home. And I won't use the word indoctrinate, but make it hard, I think, for some children to choose different ways of living, and indeed sometimes to know about different ways of living and the kinds of ways that other children in their society are in fact living.
In the book, you resist the idea that religion is special. So is your worry here going to apply to any parental attempt to inculcate some kind of overall philosophy or worldview, or sending a child to a school that matches your overall philosophy and worldview? Or is there something different about religious education? So I guess here I'm thinking about a parent who says, well, I'm sort of roughly liberal with vague sentiments towards Christianity, and so I send my child to the local C of E school. Are those the cases that are troubling you here? Would it trouble you if it was just, I'm going to send my kid to the local state school because I approve of the things that they teach there about climate change and microaggressions? Is there something special about religion?
Well, yeah, so religion, I mean, the answer is kind of yes and no. What's special about religion typically is that it's kind of what, in the language of political philosophy, we call a comprehensive doctrine. So it tends to have implications for how people live their lives in general. So that's partly why there's a worry about children developing the capacity for autonomy, and that's why there's a worry about parents acting on their own judgments about these comprehensive doctrines in ways that subject their children to their own views and don't respect what my colleague Matthew Clayton calls the independence of children. But in other ways, religion isn't special. So, for example, we're just as hostile to the idea of an atheist school as we are to the idea of a religious school. So atheist parents, in our view, shouldn't be allowed to send their children to schools that teach their children to be atheists, teach that religion is rubbish, and so on. So in that sense, religion is just an example.
And when it comes to homeschooling, are we in similar turf? It seems like most people homeschooling are going to be exercising too much control over their child's worldview, even if it's not religious homeschool?
Well, so we do, like I think all liberal political philosophers, we do end up treating some kind of liberal framework of values as different in kind from the kinds of comprehensive doctrines that people may be free to choose when they're thinking about how to live their own lives. So homeschooling, yes, of course, parents will be teaching their children to do some things and not others. We hope they'll teaching them to be honest. They'll be teaching them to respect others, and the kind of pretty kind of standard liberal agenda. But when it comes to homeschooling, as we'll talk about later, just partly for practical reasons, you have to allow parents more discretion. If you're going to allow homeschooling, you can't have inspectors going into people's homes and kind of checking exactly what's being delivered. And we do end up actually arguing that there should be much more regulation even of homeschooling. I mean, the amount to which homeschooling is regulated at the moment is kind of, in my view, kind of ludicrously negligible. There just isn't much at all. So I think there are limits on what parents, even as homeschoolers, should be allowed to do for their children. For example, we end up arguing that all children should be taught a syllabus that teaches them about other people's religions, that gives them some civic competencies and helps them understand their civic duties. And we think if you're going to homeschool your child, you still have to make sure your kid knows that stuff. You can't just raise them in your own view about how they should live their lives, whether that's religious or atheistic or, very spiritual, but not in a way that fits a conventional religion or so on.
Let's dive deeper into the philosophical underpinnings that are going on here. So we've talked a bit about children's autonomy now. So this is the worry that what religious schooling might be doing is over-indoctrinating your child. We don't want to use the word indoctrinating, but over-encouraging your child into one particular worldview. What's interesting about your contribution to the book, or one of the things I found interesting, is that you're someone who's associated with talking a bunch about parental rights. So you think parents do have lots of rights, although not too many rights. So could you perhaps tell us a bit about your account of parental rights?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So my view about parents' rights, that is the rights we have as parents to do things to, for, and with our children, is that the way to understand the rights people really have is by thinking about how they can discharge the role of being a parent. What do you need to allow parents to be free to do to, with, and for their children that will enable them to do the job? And our understanding of what that job is basically to act as in legal terms, they would call a fiduciary. So their job is to protect their children's interests, sometimes to advance their children's interests, where those interests are mainly in developing into healthy, autonomous adults capable of living lives that they enjoy and so on. And in fact, in the society we live in, we grant parents rights that go way beyond that. We grant parents rights to do things to, with, and for the children that suit the parents, and that they may think are serving their children's interests. I'm sure many, religious parents sincerely believe that what they're doing by sending their child to a religious school, for example, is to promote their children's interests, given their beliefs. But in our view, that's actually exceeding their proper authority, because they don't need to act on those judgments in relation to their children in order to act as the child's fiduciary on what we think is the right understanding of what the relevant children's interests are. In the kind of more philosophical bit of the book, I actually argue that parents shouldn't be allowed to intentionally raise their child in a particular religion at all. Never mind sending them to a religious school, but just in principle, they're kind of exceeding the proper scope of their authority if they intentionally raise their child in a particular religion. So that's much more controversial than what we end up arguing for in the book, and we can talk about why those two views differ.
It's a very radical view, I think, right? So at one point you're talking about prayer, and you say, okay, it might be all right to have a go at praying with your child briefly, but it won't be all right to make that a kind of daily practice or a regular practice in your home. It might be okay to take them to the church a couple of times, but it won't be okay to take them.
Yeah, so the view is
That's right.
The view is roughly that it's a good thing for parents to reveal their religious beliefs to their children, and to some extent to share their understanding of the world with their children. We don't want to kind of completely alienate parents from their children, but it's really very challenging to raise a child to be autonomous, given the huge emotional influence that parents have over their children. I think so. Yeah, too much kind of let's all do this together because this is what mummy or daddy think is the right way to live will make it, especially if it's exacerbated by a school that's giving the same message about this is the right way to live, will, I think, make it hard for some children to become autonomous. Not all, it's perfectly possible. We know children develop autonomy who have had religious upbringings. We know there are children who have had religious upbringings and been to a religious school, who nonetheless, develop their autonomy and they may come to endorse the same religion but autonomously, or they may come to reject it and live a different way of life. So nobody's saying it's impossible to develop autonomy if you have a religious upbringing. But especially if the family and the school are kind of lined up, or what gets called continuous, if the environment is very continuous, and if that environment doesn't even give access or adequate access to other ways of living, to knowledge about other ways of living, then I do think parents are exceeding the kind of their proper scope. They're going beyond what they have a right to do.
This makes me wonder. So in the book, it sounds like you think it's problematic to inculcate your religion, even just as a parent, irrespective of when we get to the schooling. But is your position actually that I could say, take my child to church every week if I sent them to a school where they were taught about different religions? That it's the combining of them that makes for the overwhelming threat to autonomy.
So that, I think, is the view of one of my colleagues, Andrew Mason. So one of the interesting things about this book, I think, is that there are 4 authors altogether, but 3 of us offer our own kind of individual takes at the philosophical level. And we actually disagree about exactly that question, I think. So Andrew Mason, I think, thinks that, there's a particular risk to some children if the home environment is too continuous with the school environment, and that risk is sufficient so although he thinks parents should be free to raise their children in their own religion, and he also thinks that they should be free to send their children to a religious school, in principle, in practice, there's just too much risk that children will be denied autonomy. And one of the state's jobs, we think, is to kind of guarantee that children have a right to be given an autonomous upbringing, an autonomy facilitating, let's call it, upbringing. So whereas my view and Matthew Clayton's view is this much more extreme one, that you're just exceeding your kind of, it's ultra vires to raise your child in the religion at home. But so you can take them to church to show them what you believe in. So this is what we do, this is what we think. And, some degree, in my view, of kind of sharing certain kind of religious practices is going to be helpful to the family relationship. But parents, I think, should find a way of preventing that turning into raising their child in that religion. And making it hard for the child to come to reject the influences that come from those practices. There's something similar happens when we talk about school. Something similar happens when we say you shouldn't even be able to have religious assemblies and sing, and have prayers at school, because there are lots of schools that say, well, we're not teaching religion, we're not teaching our children to be Christians, but we'll do a little bit of praying in assembly at the beginning of the day, and we'll talk a little bit about God or something like that. Well, we think that that's not okay, because these practices affect people's emotions, they affect people's identities in ways that, and often they are actually premised on the truth of the entities that are being kind of sung about or talked about. So it's not just that you can't kind of teach your child, this is true, there is this God, or there isn't that God. It's that you can't even do things, on our view, that make it harder for the child to develop her own autonomy. And in fact, Matthew Clayton thinks you're just not respecting even if the child does develop autonomy still you've wronged them, because you wronged them by treating them on the basis of reasons that are not appropriate for you to act on if you're in a position of parental authority over a child. Just like the state shouldn't be a Christian state or a Muslim state or a Jewish state. So the family should not be a Christian family. The individuals as adults can choose to be Christians or Jews or Muslims, but there's something going wrong when authority is exercised over people in the name of a religion.
So this is two pretty hardcore liberals and one liberal who's slightly less hardcore. Let me try and push the alternative view that has fallen out of favour in political philosophy, but I always had a secret fondness for, and that's what we call the communitarians. Mm-hmm. So I guess if I was going to take their side on this debate, I would say something like, there's something oddly formless, unattached, and rootless about the kind of citizen you're trying to raise here, right? It's a child that doesn't have a tradition and a community and a mythology, right? I don't even have to think the religion is real. I might just think it's really important to have a rich tradition with some deep myths that often are kind of similar amongst different religions and tell us some important moral principles about how we should treat each other. And a world where we encourage parents not to inculcate in their children an attachment to the particularities of the tradition that they're being raised in, the myths, the morals, the traditions, is one where we won't end up with autonomous people at the end. We'll end up with very confused people. That it's better to start from a rooted attachment and then later question it, which is a normal part of adolescence and early adulthood, than it is to think that the way to get autonomy is to encourage a child that is rootless, that when they come to their moment of challenge has nothing they're kicking against.
Yes, that's a very kind of respectable, as we say, view. So why don't I agree with it? I don't think it's true that you need to teach people. I don't think it's true that you need to raise children in a particular religious view. So telling them about mythologies, telling them about different narratives, different ways people live their lives, explaining the different ways in which religious outlooks can support moral values, that's all actually, fine by us. But your stronger claim, the more relevant claim, is that you actually need to be kind of raised to believe in a doctrine. You need to have been told that that doctrine is true and in some sense or other have been committed to it, or maybe just temporarily committed to it, something like that, provisionally. And autonomy is kind of about rejecting that view.
Or reckoning with it. I mean, at the end you may accept it,
yes,
but to reckon.
I shouldn't have said reject.
With something you
thinking
really
about it for yourself properly. And there's a wonderful book by a political philosopher called Ian McMullen, who argues specifically that at primary school, what we call directed religious education should be permitted. But then at secondary school, or kind of at adolescence, that's when it starts to matter that horizons are broadened and people can start to think for themselves. And obviously that completely disagrees with my kind of view that parents shouldn't be allowed to do this at all. So it kind of turns on, well, are people who have not been raised in a comprehensive doctrine, are they rootless? I mean, are they unaffiliated? I don't think so.
I guess we might have ended up in a kind of empirical moment, right? We've got to know now, if we looked at people who were raised within religion and people who weren't, who looks like at adulthood has the better set of skills. I guess
we have to remember all the people who we're not thinking about, who are raised in this religion and never occurs to them to think to do anything else. I can walk the streets of Oxford, you can walk the streets of northeast London, and you'll see such people, right? So we want a solution that kind of, I think we're going to agree, we want a solution that protects those children from, let's call that indoctrination, where they never really made a valid alternative. And maybe there's a kind of institutional solution that would kind of get the balance right. It's part of my claim that that's not part of the parent's job, because you don't need that to get autonomy. It's part of your claim, maybe, that maybe it is actually part of the parent's job to raise their children with some pretty strong, maybe even comprehensive views, in order that they can have this sense of attachment, which they can then reckon with in due course.
It's interesting the way that you're framing your parental rights here. So they've become a kind of, it almost sounds like you're framing it as like you should do the minimum possible, Like, you're only allowed to do this much and no more. That's not the way we normally approach parenting, right?
That's right.
And so it's an interesting moment of challenge then to how most of us think we're doing this job, right? We've got to raise our kids right. We've got to inculcate certain things that we all think are shared values and so on. And you're saying, actually, careful.
Well, the shared values,
Don't go
that is part of the job, to kind of raise them to be good citizens.
Right, yeah, socially shared values. But I meant shared within the family unit, right? People will often say, we're the kind of family that likes to go camping or that goes to church, and these are the kinds of things you're questioning.
Well, yeah, so things like liking to go camping and things like that, they may be fine, right? Sharing,
because it's not comprehensive, right?
yeah,
the way
and
that
because
this religion
they're very partial. It's not clear that they really involve any strong conception of the good, as opposed to just this is something we like to do.
Before we turn to policy, there's one more question I want to ask about religions that pops up a couple of times in the book in different ways, which is whether, and I think you're more worried about some religious traditions than others. So I was thinking about it. If I was someone who was very worried about autonomy and I was thinking about religious traditions, they look like there are some that are fine. So here I was thinking of a certain kind of Catholicism that says the way to God is through reason. So you've got to understand the arguments for God. You're meant to challenge and question them. And the route to God is not through a kind of blind faith, but through rationality. Now, that looks like it might be autonomy building in the long run, right? It's a real training in how to think about big questions reasonably. And another tradition that occurred to me was a kind of liberal Judaism, right? Where it's much more about the culture. It's much less about committing to these big kind of overwhelming claims about the nature of God, or more, it's much more a kind of inhabiting a particular kind of community way of thinking about a religion, rather than thinking about it as being all about the God figure and one's religious traditions around it. And so I did wonder whether some religions worry you more than others, and whether those two that I've offered you, one that's kind of like a C of E or a certain kind of Judaism that looks like it becomes quite loose in its philosophical commitments, or on the other hand, are kind of quite harsh on philosophical commitments, or quite strong on philosophical commitments, kind of Catholicism, but that encourages questioning.
So I've got slightly two hats on here now, because there's the book, which is kind of co-authored and where we
I'm not
have to be a bit careful, and then I have to think about, so what do I think about this? So yes, definitely my view has different implications depending on kind of, as it were, how liberal the content of the religion is. It's going to be much less problematic to raise your children to say, well, this is what we believe. Lots of people believe these other things, than to kind of have a view, perpetual damnation unless you live your life this particular way, or that kind of thing. And now I've forgotten the other aspect.
So there was I offered two
Judaism, whether Judaism counts as a religion. In this,
I mean, I was counting it, but I was counting it as a kind of liberal kind, a bit like the C of E tradition in certain respect, perhaps with a stronger sense of community, but not this kind of all comprehensiveness that you sometimes see in certain religions. I guess the other religion that I wanted to present to you, though, was the Catholic, right? Who are not light and not particularly liberal necessarily, but who very much think that the way to God is through reason. Right, that's one defining feature that some people think is the difference between, say, Catholicism and evangelical traditions.
Yeah,
so it's going to lean on the faith, just blind faith, just believe anyway. And the other says, no, here are my arguments. I've got all the arguments worked out. Let's talk about them.
Yeah, so you're probably exposing my kind of lack of deep familiarity with variants of Catholicism here. I mean, the way I've heard it is they're teaching their children there is God, there is a God, and here are the arguments for why there is a God. And we can think it all through, and then we'll see, and we'll do those kind of arguments I had to learn as an undergraduate, about proofs of the existence of God. Well, I don't know. That's not, so in my view, that's not okay, because you're kind of, as it were, the whole exercise is premised on this controversial and reasonably rejectable judgment that you don't need to be doing in kind of imposing on your kid, or in order to properly parent them.
I think here we've nicely circled back to that communitarian and liberal divide we were having, right? So one story says rooted in a tradition, but it's a tradition that encourages reason, that says you should have a reason you think these things. Yeah. And there's your skill set that you can then take out and become autonomous. And I guess you've got a slightly different view of what it is to be autonomous at adulthood, which is there's nothing you're so strongly committed to or been raised to be so strongly committed to that it will be a struggle and costly to give it up. Is that fair, or
that's pretty fair on the kind of issue of achieving autonomy as an end state, right? I think that what you said kind of was like a fair, rough characterization of the issue. If what we're thinking about is, will my children achieve autonomy, and supposing it's my job to make sure they do. There's the other side of it, which Matthew Clayton would be particularly keen on, and my kind of strict reading of parents' rights insists, which just says, well, even if they do develop autonomy, you still fail, in Matthew's language, you still fail to respect their moral independence. What is this community that has the right to get its children to become autonomous through this particular set of religious views? Why does it have the claim to do that to this individual child?
And one of the fascinating things about this book is that it's written by four of you. Three major positions are laid out in the middle, but you all come up in the end with a shared set of regulatory principles. Let's turn to that. So, how was it to co-author? Were you surprised to all end up in the same place? And then let's talk about what that place was.
Good. Yeah. So I think in a way this is the kind of most distinctive feature of the book is that it is co-authored in this way. And there are things we agree about and things we disagree about. So it's called How to Think About Religious Schools. And there's a kind of reason for that, which is we are mainly concerned to help people think about religious schools, at least as much as to kind of persuade them of our conclusions about what they should think about religious schools. So quite a lot of the book is about setting out a kind of analytical framework for thinking about the issues that arise. And I say it's a little bit analogous to a chemist's periodic table. There are these kind of elements that go to make up people's positions on these issues. And we're trying to, and I won't go into it all now, but kind of there's a kind of analytical aspect of the book. It just says, look, these are the kinds of things you're going to need to think about. And you're going to have to weigh these different kinds of normative considerations. So we agree about that. And then we also agree in our kind of method, which is kind of how to get from philosophy to policy. So you need to think about all these normative considerations and how to balance them: children's interests, parents' interests, our interests as citizens, their interests as future citizens, and so on. Then we have to look at what's realistic, what's feasible in the circumstances. And that's why our book, the policy regulation bit, is just about England. So the philosophy is like, is philosophy. It's kind of everywhere and maybe nowhere, but it's not tied to a specific geographical jurisdiction. Whereas our proposals are very specifically for England. And if we were in the Netherlands, if we were in the States, if we were in France, if we were in Ireland, we'd be making very different proposals. We'd have different views about, I think, what was really kind of realistic in those contexts. So when we apply this method, we have slightly different philosophical views. But then we say, well, okay, when we get to the kind of the policy bit, like how should these schools be regulated? What should the rules be, both for state schools and for private religious schools? Then, albeit coming from slightly different places, we all agree that this is the kind of most coherent overall package for a kind of a realistic way forward. Now, it's not realistic in the sense that, anybody, or certainly not many people, would vote for it tomorrow, because it's quite radical in its implications. It's very different from current practice, and it would be very controversial. But it's realistic in the sense that, we think that proper airing and serious debate over time, just as people talk about laws on homosexuality or abortion or so on, today's common sense was yesterday's completely wacky idea. And we think that getting people to see the extent to which children are dominated by their parents and not respected by their parents and not treated as independent moral agents properly by their parents will be quite a big transformation in our thinking about the family. And we'll come to see how terrible it was that we gave parents such extreme authority over their kids.
So children's liberation movement is the next step after this book. We'll start with religious schools and then it's...
Yeah, it's a children's liberation movement, but in my version of it, one that says parents are really important for children. There is a version of children's liberation that kind of says, we should just let kids run free and, all this authority that adults exercise over them, that's a terrible idea. Whereas I don't think that at all. I think, children need authority. They need parental authority.
Yes, I mean, you're very clear on the kind of need for an attachment, the need, and that's one of the wonderful things about your work, I think, is the sensitivity to the importance that the parent has to the child.
Yeah, it's
now and in the future.
For some readers, my work on the family is a kind of reactionary defense of the family because it insists that these parent-child relationships are really, really important.
I think there's two facets of the importance. One I agree with you, one I'm less clear on, which is, so there's the attachment thing, which I totally buy, and then there's also this authoritative thing. And I wonder if some of the reactionary stuff comes to the authoritative aspect of what you think's going on with that attachment relation.
Yeah.
Which I guess not everyone would necessarily sign up. There's two separate claims there.
Yeah, I agree.
That's all interesting stuff. We got down into the parenting weeds, and I'm aware of time, but there's just to close us, it would be fantastic if you'd give us a kind of one or two headlines of these policies. You're saying they've got some radical policy proposals,
right,
even though we've all ended up agreeing on them. What do you think people might be quite struck by? Well, if you had to pick one for this Parliament, what would it be?
Oh no! I won't go for this Parliament, but the kind of the headlines are that the state schools should not be allowed to engage in directive teaching. But they should be allowed to have a kind of what we call a faith ethos, which is actually a phrase in kind of current legislation. So I don't have time. We don't really want to get into details. But, currently there are a lot of schools in England that have officially registered as having a religious character. And this affects what they can do. I think about a third of schools have a religious character, mainly Christian. When we wrote the grant for this book, one of the referees said, it's obvious that this is really about Muslim schools because that was what was in the news at the time. And actually, Muslim schools are tiny relative to Christian schools in the UK. The numbers are completely different. So I can't remember how I got onto that. But we shouldn't be allowed to have directive schooling.
But this faith ethos schooling you're not so worried about. So if there's a C of E or a Muslim school that doesn't have directive teaching.
There are ways in which a school can have a religious character if it has what we call a faith ethos. And the way that the argument for that, for at least for two of the three of us, is that that's the most realistic way to stop parents going private or to stop them retreating into homeschooling. And I actually think quite a lot of government policy is actually influenced by this thought anyway, that you want to allow enough religion in schools to make them kind of attractive to religiously minded parents so that they don't
and presumably
into a less regulated sector or indeed into homeschooling. And the boundary between homeschooling and private schooling is very, very blurred anyway. Groups of families get together, and when does it become a school and so on. And the main thought is that that's not so problematic from the point of view of their emerging autonomy.
What about the permissions to opt out of, say, sex education or other bits of the syllabus that are in conflict with one's religious tradition?
Yeah, so we're not very keen. We're not very keen on that.
It seems to me like that would be an obvious for all three of you.
Yeah. So and we've talked a lot about children's autonomy, and that's obviously one reason why you want them to know about same-sex relationships. You want them to know about whatever gets taught in current sex education or relationship education. I mean, it's a hazardous, as you know, kind of what the curriculum for those must look like now. I really don't know. But it's important for children's autonomy that they get to know these things. But it's also important because they're going to be living alongside, even if they're the most kind of conventional, heterosexual, bionormative, whatever you want to say, person themselves, they're going to be living alongside fellow citizens who will have very different views. So if parents can take their kids out of classes where they learn about how other people are living their lives or the choices available to them, then that's very problematic and it shouldn't be allowed. And in fact, we advocate, so we say a lot about what schools shouldn't do, and then we say something about what they should do, which is we advocate this curriculum in civic, religious, ethical and moral education. And we think that should really be the way in which children get taught about religion, but not giving religion a special status, because there are lots of non-religious answers to questions about how we should live, how we should treat each other. The Humanist Society is main lobby group that kind of is always going on about this. But the humanism or religious in the conventional sense views should be on the table and discussed. And we think that all children should get all that stuff, even children who are homeschooled. So that even if you're going to homeschool your kid, you still have to, in some way or other, deliver the cream syllabus. Not necessarily yourself, but you need to make sure your kids get that stuff.
Thank you, Adam, for that really deep dive into children's liberation, the nature of religion, what it is to parent well, and of course, religious schools. So we've been discussing a recent book by Adam Swift and his co-authors, Matthew Clayton, Andrew Mason, and along with Ruth Wareham, published with the University Press, called How to Think About Religious Schools, Principles and Policies. Full details as ever are going to be in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be talking about whether there's a human right against discrimination with Saladin Mekhled Garcia. To make sure you don't miss out on those future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. And you can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Emily McTernan. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.